a legendary music genius, a Hollywood actress chasing her comeback, and one fatal night that shattered both lives. Behind the glamour lay obsession, violence, and a chilling mystery that gripped the world. This is the story of Phil Spector and Lana Clarkson, where fame turned deadly and truth demanded justice. Phil Spector's life had always been wrapped in contradictions. On one side, a revolutionary genius of the music industry, and on the other, a deeply disturbed man whose erratic behavior became almost as infamous as the songs he produced. Born in the Bronx in 1939, he was raised in a modest Jewish family that later relocated to Los Angeles after the death of his father. That early trauma left a scar that shaped much of Spector's inner world. He turned to music, pouring his emotions into sound, and by the late 1950s he was already carving out a name for himself in the business. The world would come to know him as the architect of the Wall of Sound, a dense, layered production technique that changed the very fabric of rock and pop. He worked with legendary groups like the Ronettes, the Crystals, and later even with the Beatles, co-producing their final album Let It Be. Spector's touch was golden, and yet beneath that brilliance, those who worked with him often described him as mercurial, paranoid, and intimidating. By the late 1990s, Spector was less present in the recording studio but remained a larger-than-life figure in Hollywood. He was eccentric in appearance, often wearing elaborate wigs, sunglasses, and flamboyant clothing. More troubling, however, were the whispers that surrounded him. Stories of his fixation on firearms and his habit of pulling guns on women when arguments spiraled out of control. These rumors floated around the entertainment circles for years, dismissed by some as exaggerated tales of a reclusive genius but taken seriously by others who had seen his volatility firsthand. On the other side of this story stood Lana Clarkson. Born in 1962, Lana had dreams of stardom from a young age. She pursued modeling and acting, and during the 1980s, she carved a niche for herself in the world of low-budget fantasy and action films. Her most iconic role was in Barbarian Queen, a cult classic that showcased her striking looks, tall frame, and commanding screen presence. While she never reached the heights of mainstream stardom, she was admired by fans of the genre and enjoyed modest recognition. By the early 2000s, however, her career had slowed considerably. Hollywood was not kind to actresses over 35, and Lana found herself in a familiar struggle for women in the industry, trying to remain visible in a world obsessed with youth. Financial pressures led her to take a job as a hostess at the House of Blues on the Sunset Strip, a job she approached with professionalism, but also with the quiet knowledge that it was far removed from the red carpets she once graced. The night of February 2, 2003, seemed like just another evening for Clarkson at the club. Phil Spector, then 63, arrived at the venue with his usual aura of wealth and mystery. He was known at the House of Blues. Celebrities often drifted in and out of its doors, and he was treated with the deference that came with his reputation. Spector and Clarkson crossed paths that night, and according to witnesses, he appeared taken with her. After some conversation, he asked her to join him for a drink, and eventually extended an invitation to his home in Alhambra, a sprawling mansion he called the Pyrenees Castle. Lana, ever polite and perhaps flattered, accepted. They left the House of Blues together in Spector's chauffeur-driven Mercedes. His driver that night, Adriano de Souza, would later become one of the most pivotal figures in the story. A quiet and observant man, de Souza drove them back to the castle but remained in the vehicle while Spector and Clarkson went inside. What happened in the hours that followed would become the subject of intense speculation, debate, and ultimately courtroom testimony. Sometime after 5 a.m., a loud gunshot shattered the silence of the mansion. Moments later, Spector emerged from the front door, gun in hand, and according to de Souza, uttered the chilling words, "I think I killed somebody." Inside, Lana Clarkson was slumped in a chair, a gunshot wound to her mouth. Her life ended in an instant. For law enforcement officers called to the scene, the image was jarring. A glamorous actress found dead in the home of one of music's most enigmatic figures. From the very beginning, Spector's version of events clashed with the evidence and testimony around him. He insisted that Lana had taken her own life, claiming she was despondent and depressed over her career and personal struggles. Yet, investigators quickly began to piece together a different narrative. They learned of Spector's long history of erratic behavior, particularly with women. Accounts surfaced of him brandishing guns in moments of anger or insecurity, often when women tried to leave him. Several ex-girlfriends described scenes that were eerily similar to what may have unfolded the night Lana died. Evenings that began with charm and attention but ended with fear and intimidation. Meanwhile, Lana's family and friends pushed back firmly against the idea of suicide. They described her as optimistic and resilient, someone who had always fought through the ups and downs of Hollywood. Though her career had slowed, she was exploring new ventures, including comedy and writing, and she remained socially active. To those who knew her best, the idea that she would end her life in the mansion of a man she had just met felt not only implausible but insulting. As the investigation deepened, Adriano de Souza's testimony became critical. He recalled waiting outside the mansion, hearing the gunshot, and then seeing his employer step outside holding the weapon. This first-hand account placed Spector directly at the center of the tragedy and raised serious doubts about his claims of suicide. In the months that followed, the media swarmed the story. It was a perfect storm of Hollywood scandal. A legendary but reclusive music producer, a beautiful actress whose life had ended in mystery, and a narrative filled with guns, mansions, and celebrity excess. Photographs of Spector from his court appearances became notorious in their own right, his towering wigs and eccentric attire turning him into an almost surreal figure. For many watching, it felt like a twisted drama that blurred the lines between fame and infamy, genius and madness. As prosecutors prepared to bring the case to trial, they faced a daunting challenge. Convicting someone as famous as Phil Spector meant cutting through his legacy and focusing solely on the evidence. For the defense, the strategy was clear. Paint Clarkson as unstable, argue that she took her own life, and frame Spector as a victim of tragedy rather than a perpetrator of violence. What began as a late-night encounter at a Hollywood nightclub would soon escalate into one of the most gripping courtroom sagas of the decade. The stage was set for a battle that would pit the image of a musical genius against the testimony of witnesses, the pain of a grieving family, and the chilling reality of a woman who entered a mansion one night and never came out alive. The trial of Phil Spector became a spectacle unlike any other, a courtroom drama that captivated the public and turned into a media obsession. When proceedings finally began in 2007, more than 4 years after Lana Clarkson's death, the anticipation had reached a fever pitch. The case was no longer just about one woman's tragic death. It had evolved into a referendum on celebrity privilege, male power, and the darker side of Hollywood. The cameras waited outside every day as the bizarre image of Phil Spector, with his eccentric wigs and flamboyant suits, became a fixture on nightly news broadcasts. Reporters described him as a man walking into courtrooms as if they were stages. Yet behind that spectacle was a high-stakes battle for his freedom. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Alan Jackson, laid out its case with methodical precision. Their narrative was simple but devastating. Lana Clarkson had gone to Phil Spector's home willingly, but when she attempted to leave, Spector, in a fit of anger and control, pulled a gun and shot her. To prove this, they introduced not just the forensic evidence from that night, but also a disturbing pattern of behavior spanning decades. Several women who had dated Spector came forward to describe chillingly similar incidents. They spoke of evenings that started with charm but turned threatening when they tried to leave, with Spector brandishing a gun to stop them. This pattern of control and violence painted a portrait of a man who could not bear rejection and who used firearms as tools of intimidation. Among the most important witnesses was Adriano de Souza, the chauffeur. Calm and unshaken, he recounted the events of that early morning in February 2003. He testified that after the loud bang from inside the mansion, Spector stepped outside holding a pistol and muttered words that suggested guilt. "I think I killed somebody." De Souza's testimony carried weight, not just because he had no motive to lie, but because his account fit seamlessly with the physical evidence investigators had gathered inside the home. The defense, led initially by the famed attorney Bruce Cutler, fought back with equal vigor. Their argument centered on Lana Clarkson's state of mind. They painted her as a woman deeply unhappy with her stalled career, struggling with personal disappointments, and vulnerable to despair. They claimed she had taken her own life in a tragic moment of weakness. They also attempted to dismantle the credibility of the witnesses who described Spector's past behavior, arguing that their testimonies were colored by bitterness or opportunism. To the defense, Phil Spector was not a murderer but rather a victim of tragic circumstance, trapped in a situation where a woman ended her life in his home. Forensic experts became key players in the unfolding courtroom drama. The prosecution's experts argued that the trajectory of the gunshot, the position of the body, and the evidence at the scene all pointed toward homicide. The defense countered with their own experts who insisted that the gunshot could indeed have been self-inflicted. The clash of scientific interpretations left jurors to navigate a battlefield of expert testimony, each side presenting complex and often conflicting narratives about what the physical evidence truly revealed. Lana Clarkson's family sat through the proceedings with visible pain, determined to see justice for their daughter and sister. Friends of Clarkson testified about her life, her plans, and her resilience, rejecting the defense's claims of depression and suicide. They spoke of her humor, her optimism, and her continued efforts to reinvent herself despite career setbacks. Each personal testimony reminded the courtroom that Lana was not just a name in a file but a vibrant woman whose life had been cut short. The trial stretched on for months, with the press dissecting every detail. Outside the courthouse, media outlets debated whether Spector's legacy as a music icon would sway jurors. The defense leaned heavily on his reputation, portraying him as a misunderstood genius. Yet the image presented inside the courtroom was of a man whose eccentricity had long since crossed into darkness, whose paranoia and need for control had created an environment of fear around him. When the jury finally began deliberations, the tension was palpable. Reporters gathered outside waited for word, and the world watched closely. But in September 2007, after 15 days of deliberation, the jury announced they were deadlocked. 10 jurors favored conviction, 2 favored acquittal. The judge declared a mistrial. The result sent shockwaves through both the prosecution and the public. For Lana Clarkson's family, it was a devastating setback, while Spector and his legal team saw it as a temporary reprieve. The mistrial highlighted just how difficult it was to convict someone of Spector's stature, even when the evidence appeared compelling. But prosecutors were not willing to let the matter rest. They announced almost immediately that they would retry the case. By the time the second trial began in 2008, Spector's legal team had changed. Bruce Cutler had stepped down, replaced by attorneys Dorn Weinberg and Roger Rosen, who sought to refine the defense strategy. This time, the prosecution tightened their case, honing in on the most compelling evidence and testimony. They reintroduced the chilling stories of Spector's past behavior, demonstrating once again a clear pattern of intimidation with firearms. They also emphasized D'Souza's testimony, ensuring jurors understood the significance of his words on the morning of the shooting. The defense continued to argue suicide, suggesting Clarkson had grown despondent and impulsively ended her own life. But their strategy suffered under the weight of public perception and the prosecution's streamlined arguments. Clarkson's family once again testified about her spirit and plans, humanizing her against the defense's portrayal of instability. The retrial lacked some of the theatrics of the first, but it carried a sharper edge, both sides knowing the stakes could not be higher. Throughout it all, Phil Spector sat in the courtroom, often silent, hidden beneath wigs and oversized glasses, an almost surreal figure. His presence became symbolic of the bizarre duality at the heart of the case. A man capable of creating timeless art but equally capable, prosecutors argued, of cold-blooded violence. As closing arguments approached, the trial had become more than the story of one crime. It had become a cultural touchpoint, a reflection of the dangers of unchecked celebrity power and the vulnerability of women in spaces dominated by wealth and influence. The jurors, 12 ordinary citizens, carried the burden of determining whether Phil Spector, once hailed as a genius, was also a murderer. When the second jury finally withdrew to deliberate, the world once again held its breath. This time, however, the outcome would not end in stalemate. The evidence had been presented with greater clarity, the witnesses' voices stronger, and the narrative more cohesive. As the days passed, anticipation built. For Lana Clarkson's loved ones, it was the final chance to see justice delivered. For Spector, it was the moment that would decide whether his name would be remembered as a musical visionary or forever stained with the label of killer. The retrial of Phil Spector reached its climax in April 2009, and by then the courtroom had become a stage for the final act of a story that had gripped the world for more than 6 years. The jurors, after weeks of listening to testimony and examining the evidence, filed back into the Los Angeles courtroom, their decision sealed. When the foreperson announced that Spector was guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Lana Clarkson, a ripple of emotion swept through the room. For Clarkson's family, there was both relief and sorrow. Justice had been served, but nothing could bring back the vibrant woman they had lost. For Spector, the verdict marked the ultimate fall from grace, a confirmation that the genius who had shaped modern music would spend the rest of his life defined by violence rather than art. The sentence that followed underscored the gravity of the crime. Phil Spector was given 19 years to life in prison, meaning he would be well into his 80s before he would even be eligible for parole. The once powerful figure of the music industry, accustomed to mansions, entourages, and adoration, was now reduced to an inmate, his eccentric wigs traded for the plain uniforms of the prison system. For many, the image of Spector sitting in court as the sentence was read was a haunting symbol of wasted genius. A man who had once commanded studios and orchestrated groundbreaking records, now condemned by his own demons. The aftermath of the trial was not just about the conviction. It was also about the legacy of Lana Clarkson. Her name had too often been overshadowed by the celebrity of the man who killed her. But in the years following the verdict, tributes to her life began to emerge. Friends and family spoke of her warmth, humor, and generosity. They remembered her not as a tragic figure, but as someone who had persevered through the difficulties of Hollywood with dignity and resilience. She had been a daughter, a sister, and a friend, whose presence brought joy to those around her. In documentaries and interviews, her life was recentered, a reminder that beneath the sensational headlines was a woman whose story mattered. The case also raised broader conversations about power and accountability in Hollywood. Phil Spector was not the first celebrity to face criminal charges, but his conviction sent a powerful message that fame and influence could not shield someone from the law. The stories of women who had testified about Spector's history of threats and violence also echoed louder after the verdict. For years, their voices had been dismissed or minimized, but now they were recognized as vital in establishing a pattern that ultimately brought justice for Lana Clarkson. In a way, the trial exposed the dangers of silence, showing how unchecked behavior, when ignored, could lead to devastating consequences. In prison, Spector's life dwindled into obscurity. He continued to appeal his conviction, maintaining his claim that Clarkson had taken her own life, but the courts upheld the jury's decision. His health declined over the years, and the man once associated with glamour and brilliance became a cautionary tale of self-destruction. When he died in 2021, serving his sentence, the news was met with mixed reactions. Some mourned the loss of a musical pioneer whose influence on rock and pop was undeniable. Others felt no sympathy, focusing instead on the life he had taken and the suffering he had caused. His death closed the final chapter of a life marked by extremes: genius and madness, fame and infamy, creation and destruction. The trial itself became one of the most analyzed legal cases in Hollywood history. Law students studied it for its handling of circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. Journalists revisited it as an example of how media coverage can both illuminate and distort justice. And true crime audiences continued to examine every detail, from the haunting words Spector spoke to his chauffeur to the tragic story of Clarkson's final hours. The case embodied the collision between celebrity culture and the justice system, a reminder that behind every headline was a human life irreversibly altered. Even years later, the image of Phil Spector in court, his towering wigs and defiant posture, remained iconic in its strangeness. It was almost theatrical, as though he were still trying to perform, even as his life unraveled around him. But no performance could change the facts. No eccentricity could erase the testimonies of women who had feared him, or the grief of a family who had lost their daughter. The conviction ensured that history would not remember him only for his wall of sound, but also for the darkness that consumed him. For Lana Clarkson's loved ones, the conclusion of the trial allowed them to reclaim her memory from the shadow of specter. Her legacy shifted from being simply the victim of a famous man to being recognized as a woman of spirit and determination. Fans of her films, especially those who cherished cult cinema, rallied to honor her, celebrating the energy she brought to her roles. She was remembered at gatherings, online forums, and in tributes, her name spoken with respect and affection. In the years since, her story has been revisited not just as a crime, but as a testament to the resilience of women who navigate industries that too often exploit and discard them. The Phil Spector case continues to resonate because it sits at the crossroads of art and violence, fame and accountability. It is the story of how brilliance can be overshadowed by brutality, how a moment of rage can destroy lives, and how justice, though delayed, can finally prevail. It reminds us that behind every courtroom battle are human beings whose lives matter beyond the spectacle. Lana Clarkson's life was more than its tragic ending, and Phil Spector's career was more than its creative triumphs. Their intertwined stories became a cautionary tale that exposed the shadows lurking behind the glamour of Hollywood. As the years passed, documentaries, books, and podcasts revisited the case, each retelling trying to capture the strange, tragic duality at its core. Listeners and viewers returned again and again to the same questions. How could a man so talented be so destructive? Could Clarkson's death have been prevented if earlier warnings about Spector's behavior had been taken seriously? And what does it say about celebrity culture that it took a tragedy of this scale to strip away the protective shield around him? These questions linger, making the case more than just a story of crime and punishment. It is a mirror held up to a culture that often worships genius without reckoning with the cost. In the end, the downfall of Phil Spector and the death of Lana Clarkson became inseparable parts of Hollywood's darker history. It was not a story with redemption or reconciliation, but one that revealed truths about power, violence, and the fragility of human life. Lana Clarkson's voice was silenced on that February morning, but the pursuit of justice ensured she would not be forgotten. Phil Spector's music lives on, but so does the memory of his crime. Together, they form a legacy that is both tragic and unforgettable, a story etched into the cultural memory as one of Hollywood's most haunting true crimes. A Hollywood actor celebrated for playing a loyal cop becomes the villain in his own home. Fame, money, jealousy, and betrayal collide in a shocking true story that left 2 children without a mother. This is the chilling downfall of Michael Jace, and the night everything unraveled. In Hollywood, fame is often fleeting, and the pressure to maintain success can break even the strongest of spirits. Michael Jace was a familiar face in television and film, often cast in roles that required a blend of discipline and vulnerability. Most memorably, he played Officer Julian Lowe on the acclaimed series The Shield, a conflicted LAPD officer grappling with his identity while serving the public. On screen, he embodied loyalty and heroism. Off-screen, his reality was far darker, a life marked by financial ruin, strained relationships, and a marriage spiraling out of control. By 2014, the actor's career had largely stalled. The man who once stood under bright lights on sets and red carpets was now struggling in the shadows of mounting debt and crumbling domestic peace. Michael Jace had built a modest career in Hollywood over 2 decades. Though never a household name, he held small but memorable roles in movies like Forrest Gump, Boogie Nights, and Planet of the Apes. His television appearances, from Southland to The Shield, gave him credibility as a working actor, but consistent stardom eluded him. By his early 50s, the industry's demands seemed to outpace his opportunities. In 2011, financial records revealed the depth of his struggles. More than $500,000 in debt, unpaid bills, and a bankruptcy filing that pulled back the curtain on the instability hidden behind his public image. To outsiders, he was a Hollywood professional. To those closer, he was a man increasingly trapped by money troubles, insecurity, and the pressures of a career that no longer sustained him. Yet the collapse of Michael's professional life was not the most dangerous storm brewing. At home, his marriage to April Jace was deteriorating. April, at 40 years old, was everything Michael was not. A financial aid counselor at Biola University, she was steady, reliable, and deeply admired by her colleagues. She brought warmth and calm to the lives of students who sought her guidance. Beyond her professional life, she was devoted to her children, two young boys who saw her as the center of their universe. Friends and family described her as compassionate, faithful, and quietly resilient. But behind her gentle demeanor, April carried private fears. She confided to those closest to her that her husband's temper had grown unpredictable, that arguments were becoming frequent, and that she sometimes worried about his control over her and their household. Those close to April could sense the tension rising between the couple. Financial pressures added fuel to already simmering frustrations, and Michael's insecurities over April's independence pushed the marriage toward the brink. In quiet conversations with trusted friends, April admitted she was considering a separation. She wanted stability for her children, a life free from volatility. She loved her boys deeply, and protecting them was her guiding instinct. To those who knew her, April's consideration of leaving Michael was not an act of rebellion but of self-preservation, a step toward peace in a life clouded by conflict. On the night of May 19, 2014, these simmering conflicts erupted into a tragedy that would stun Hollywood and devastate April's family. That evening had begun like many others. April had taken her son to a baseball game, a routine slice of suburban life that reflected her devotion as a mother. After returning home to their modest Los Angeles house in Hyde Park, she was met not with the safety of familiar walls but with confrontation. Inside the home, Michael was waiting, his thoughts clouded by jealousy, anger, and despair. Their two young sons, only 8 and 5 years old, were inside as well, unsuspecting of the horror about to unfold before them. The exact words exchanged between Michael and April that night remain known only to them and to the children who overheard fragments. Prosecutors later said Michael taunted her, mocking her independence and hinting at his rage over her interest in separation. In one chilling recollection, Michael was said to have told April, "You like running, so run to heaven." Moments later, gunfire ripped through the home. Michael had shot April, fatally wounding her in front of the children. What should have been an ordinary night became the defining moment of tragedy for the Jace family, and the innocence of two young boys was shattered instantly. In the immediate aftermath, Michael Jace himself made the call to 911. His voice was calm, almost unnervingly so, as he confessed to shooting his wife. When police officers arrived at the Hyde Park residence, they found a scene of devastation. April's lifeless body, the two children traumatized and clinging to whatever sense of safety they could find, and Michael Jace sitting silently in the home that had become a crime scene. Officers moved quickly to secure the children, placing them in the care of family members while beginning the grim process of piecing together what had happened inside those walls. News of the killing spread rapidly, not only because of the shocking nature of the crime but because of who Michael was. Hollywood had long been home to scandals, but the image of an actor known for portraying a lawman now accused of murdering his wife was a chilling reminder that the roles actors played often masked the reality of their lives. Headlines highlighted his fall from grace, while April's family and colleagues mourned the sudden loss of a woman remembered for her kindness, her faith, and her dedication to her children. The entertainment world reeled, and the public was left grappling with the contradiction of a man who once embodied loyalty on screen but revealed cruelty in his personal life. For investigators, the task ahead was clear but painful. They would need to gather testimony, trace the motives, and prepare for a trial that would inevitably expose the private fractures of the Jace marriage. For April's loved ones, the road ahead was even harder. Learning to navigate a world without her presence, finding ways to care for two children scarred by what they had witnessed, and confronting the painful reality that the man who ended her life was also the father of her boys. For Michael, the reality of his actions was inescapable. The actor who once recited lines under studio lights now faced the harsh glare of police interrogation rooms, where his words would no longer be scripted, but judged by their consequences. The tragedy of that night did not unfold in isolation. It was the culmination of years of pressures, arguments, and instability. By the time police led Michael Jace away in handcuffs, the narrative of his life had changed forever. No longer was he a working actor with credits to his name. He was a husband accused of murder, a father who had inflicted irreparable trauma on his children, and a man whose fall from grace would become a cautionary tale of what can happen when pride, anger, and despair collide. The case against Michael was only beginning, but the devastation he left behind was already permanent. April's life was gone. The children's innocence was stolen. And Hollywood, once again, found itself confronting the darkness behind the glamour. As the story of Michael and April Jace moved from the screen into the stark and sobering reality of true crime. When the police led Michael Jace from his Los Angeles home on the night of May 19, 2014, the questions began immediately. Why had a man once celebrated for portraying law and order turned his own household into a crime scene? Detectives from the Los Angeles Police Department worked methodically, knowing the gravity of the case extended beyond the city's borders. This was not only a domestic homicide. It was a Hollywood story, and those stories carried weight, scrutiny, and expectation. From the moment Jace was booked into custody, investigators faced a dual task: uncover the full truth of April's killing and confront the media storm that followed. Inside the precinct, Michael sat for hours, answering questions with a quiet detachment that stunned even seasoned detectives. He admitted to pulling the trigger, leaving little doubt about his actions. But what investigators needed was a motive, a narrative that would explain why a man would end his wife's life while their children watched in horror. Financial records and family testimony soon filled in the gaps. Michael's 2011 bankruptcy filing revealed staggering debts, from mortgages to unpaid taxes. He had tried to maintain an image of stability, but the numbers told a story of desperation. In contrast, April was steady, her work at Biola University providing not only financial support but also a sense of community and purpose. This imbalance, combined with growing marital tension, painted a picture of a husband increasingly insecure about his wife's independence and resentful of her strength. Detectives interviewed neighbors, friends, and colleagues. Those who knew the couple spoke of a widening rift. April's co-workers described her as compassionate and private, though they noticed signs of strain in her personal life. Friends confided that she had quietly mentioned Michael's temper and her thoughts of leaving him. To prosecutors, these accounts were crucial. They established a pattern of control and jealousy that, when coupled with the financial collapse, created a powder keg inside the Jace household. As the case prepared to move toward trial, the role of the children became an unavoidable focus. Too young to fully process the magnitude of what they had witnessed, they nonetheless held pieces of the truth that no one else could provide. Social workers and child psychologists worked carefully to preserve their accounts, balancing the need for testimony with the protection of their fragile well-being. Their recollections, hearing their father argue with their mother, the sound of gunshots, and their mother collapsing, added a chilling authenticity to the case. These were not just legal details. They were the echoes of a night that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The prosecution team, led by the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, assembled its case with precision. Their central argument was that this was not an impulsive act but a deliberate killing fueled by resentment and rage. They pointed to the words Michael allegedly said to April, "You like running, so run to heaven," as evidence of intention. They emphasized the cruelty of committing the act in front of his children, framing it as not just murder but psychological abuse. Every detail of his financial downfall, every mention of April's fear, every recollection of Michael's controlling behavior was woven into a narrative of a man who could not accept losing control of his family. Michael's defense team, however, offered a different interpretation. They did not deny he fired the gun but argued that it was a crime of passion, the result of an emotional breaking point rather than premeditation. They highlighted his financial struggles, his crumbling career, and the weight of humiliation he carried as his life unraveled. They suggested that in the heat of argument, his actions were not planned but the desperate response of a man whose world had collapsed. It was a plea for understanding, if not forgiveness, and a bid to reduce his culpability from premeditated murder to something less severe. The courtroom became the stage for this battle. Reporters filled the benches, scribbling notes and filing updates for an audience eager to consume the spectacle of a fallen actor. Cameras captured Michael in his prison jumpsuit, a stark contrast to the uniformed officer he once portrayed on screen. April's family sat quietly in the gallery, their grief visible in every expression, their strength tested with each mention of her final moments. The trial was not only about the law, it was about reclaiming April's story from the shadow of her husband's crime. Witnesses took the stand one by one. April's friends spoke about her kindness and her devotion to her children, as well as her growing unease in her marriage. Neighbors described the sounds they heard on the night of the killing, sharp cracks that broke the ordinary quiet of the neighborhood. Experts in domestic violence testified about patterns of control, jealousy, and escalation that mirrored Michael's behavior. And then, in the most harrowing moments, the court heard from those who had spoken with the children. Their words were presented with care, but the message was clear. They had seen their father kill their mother. It was testimony no jury could ignore. Throughout the proceedings, Michael Jace sat in silence, his expressions unreadable. Some days he appeared resigned, others detached. Rarely did he show visible emotion. The prosecution interpreted this as coldness, a lack of remorse. The defense suggested it was shock, a man still processing what he had done. For the jury, his demeanor became part of the puzzle, an unscripted performance that left many wondering where the actor ended and the man began. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, the weight of the evidence grew undeniable. The prosecution's case had built layer upon layer of motive, opportunity, and intent. The defense's argument of passion seemed to shrink under the testimony of friends, neighbors, and experts. And at the heart of it all was April, a woman whose life had been taken in an instant, whose dreams for her children had been extinguished, and whose story was now being told in the sterile confines of a courtroom. When the jury finally withdrew to deliberate, the silence was heavy. For April's family, the weight was agonizing. For Michael, it was the last moment of uncertainty before his fate would be sealed. And for the public, it was the climax of a story that had begun with fame and ended in tragedy. The verdict would determine not only Michael Jace's future, but also the message the justice system would send about accountability, control, and the devastating consequences of unchecked rage. In June 2016, after days of testimony and hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. The actor once known for portraying loyalty and duty on television now stood to hear the reality of his own life. The words rang clear, guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of the verdict pressing down on everyone present. April's family embraced, tears flowing as relief mixed with grief. Michael remained still, the mask of composure unbroken, as the truth of his future came into focus. The verdict was in, but the story was not yet over. In June 2016, Michael Jace stood in a Los Angeles courtroom to hear his sentence. The jury's decision had been clear, guilty of second-degree murder. Now it was up to the judge to decide the punishment for the actor who had once been recognized on red carpets but was now defined by the brutal killing of his wife. The courtroom was packed. Reporters waited for the final word. April's family braced themselves for closure that could never be complete, and Michael faced the consequences of his actions. The judge's words cut through the silence. 40 years to life in prison. It was a sentence designed to ensure that Jace would spend the rest of his days behind bars, with little chance of freedom until he was an old man. The sentencing brought a sense of justice, but it also reopened the wounds of that night in May 2014. April's family gave statements that reflected both grief and resilience. They spoke of her devotion to her children, her kindness, and the void her death had created. They described the pain of knowing her sons had witnessed her final moments, a trauma no child should endure. Some expressed anger at Michael, others sorrow at the man who had destroyed the lives of those he was supposed to protect. For them, the sentence was not about vengeance but about accountability. It was a recognition that April's life had value and that the system had acknowledged the cruelty of her death. In prison, Michael Jace began a new existence, one stripped of the identity he had built over decades. Gone were the film sets, the television roles, and the career that had once offered promise. His name was no longer tied to the characters he played, but to the crime that had shocked Hollywood. For many, the irony was bitter. The man who had portrayed a police officer bound by duty had revealed himself incapable of protecting the most sacred duty of all, the safety of his family. To those who had admired him on screen, the fall was jarring. To April's family, it was simply the truth. A man who had chosen control over compassion, violence over understanding. The aftermath of the crime rippled outward. April's children were placed in the care of extended family, surrounded by love and support, but forever carrying the weight of what they had seen. Counselors and therapists worked with them, trying to help them process the unimaginable trauma of losing their mother at the hands of their father. Their lives became defined not only by absence but by resilience, shaped by a community determined to give them hope in the face of tragedy. April's colleagues at Biola University mourned her loss deeply. They remembered her as a beacon of support for students, someone who lifted others up even while quietly enduring her own struggles. The campus community honored her memory, ensuring her name would not be forgotten. For Hollywood, the case was another reminder of the stark divide between the roles actors play and the lives they lead. Michael Jace was not the first celebrity to fall from grace, but his case carried a particular sting because of the contrast between his on-screen persona and his real-life crime. The industry, so often criticized for glamorizing violence, was forced to confront the fact that violence had claimed one of its own, not in fiction but in reality. Tabloids ran headlines about the S.H.I.E.L.D. actor-turned-killer, while entertainment news shows dissected his past roles and his financial struggles. The coverage was relentless, but at its core was a story not of Hollywood, but of a family destroyed by domestic violence. Domestic violence advocates seized upon the case as a rallying point. They emphasized that April's fears, expressed to friends and family, reflected a pattern seen in countless households across the country. Control, jealousy, financial stress. These were not unique to the Jaces, but part of a larger crisis. April's story became a reminder that domestic abuse can exist even in households that appear stable, even in marriages that seem secure, even behind the walls of celebrity. Organizations used her case to push for greater awareness, stronger protections for victims, and more resources for families trying to escape toxic environments. In that way, April's tragedy became a catalyst for conversations that extended far beyond Los Angeles. As the years passed, the memory of April remained strongest among those who loved her most. Her family kept her spirit alive through stories shared at gatherings, through the milestones of her children's lives, and through the work of honoring her legacy. Every birthday, every holiday, every achievement of her sons carried both pride and sorrow, a reminder of the mother who should have been there to see it. The sentence handed down to Michael did not bring April back, but it ensured that her family could move forward without the looming threat of his release. The knowledge that he would spend decades behind bars offered a measure of security in a world that had once been upended. Michael himself receded into the background. Prison walls contained him and the world moved on. The actor who had once played a conflicted officer became a footnote in Hollywood history, remembered less for his performances than for the crime that ended his career. Interviews, retrospectives, and documentaries revisited the case from time to time, but they focused on April, on the children, and on the lessons to be learned. Michael's story, once marked by ambition and promise, had become a cautionary tale of what unchecked anger and desperation could unleash. In the end, the story of Michael and April Jace is not one of Hollywood glamour, but of human tragedy. It is the story of a woman whose life was cut short, of children forced to grow up with the weight of trauma, and of a man who chose destruction over redemption. It is a reminder that behind closed doors, the realities of marriage, money, and power can collide with devastating consequences. For April's family, justice was served, but healing continues. For Michael, the walls of prison will be his reality for decades, a lifetime to reflect on the choices that transformed him from actor to murderer. The case closed with a verdict, but the story lingers in the hearts of those left behind. April Jace's smile, her kindness, and her devotion to her children remain the true legacy. Michael's name is etched in infamy, a cautionary footnote in Hollywood history. And for the children who lived through the nightmare, the hope is that, despite the trauma, they will carry forward the best of their mother, her resilience, her compassion, and her strength, into lives shaped not by tragedy alone, but by the love she gave them in the years she was alive. A rising Hollywood actor, adored on screen, hides a darkness no one saw coming. Behind the fame, depression spirals into an unthinkable crime, murdering the one person who loved him most. This is the shocking true story of Ryan Grantham, where stardom, tragedy, and betrayal collide. Ryan Grantham's story begins far from the courtroom headlines that would one day carry his name across the world. Born in 1998 in British Columbia, he grew up like many Canadian children, surrounded by the steady rhythms of school, neighborhood friendships, and the quiet strength of his mother, Barbara Waite. He was a child who, by outward appearances, had a promising future. Barbara nurtured him with warmth and encouragement, giving him the foundation of stability every child needs. It was under her guidance that Ryan discovered his first taste of performance, the spark that would lead him to the camera lens before he was even a teenager. Acting became both his passion and his escape. In the early 2000s, when most children his age were still navigating the small dramas of playground friendships, Ryan was stepping into a very different kind of world. He began landing small roles in commercials and minor television appearances. Those around him noticed his ability to deliver lines with poise and a seriousness beyond his years. For Barbara, this was more than just a hobby for her son. She believed in his talent and did everything she could to help him find opportunities. She was the one who drove him to auditions, sat quietly on sets, and ensured he remained grounded despite the strange, often unforgiving world of child acting. As the years passed, Ryan's name began appearing in film credits that reached a broader audience. His role in Diary of a Wimpy Kid brought him early recognition, while his part in productions like Supernatural and iZombie showed his versatility. He seemed to balance his work with his education, moving between the classrooms of Vancouver and the soundstages of film sets. At home, his life remained simple. Barbara Waite created a supportive environment where her son could pursue his dreams while still having the structure of a normal adolescence. To those who knew her, Barbara was endlessly patient, a woman who put her child before herself at every turn. By the time Ryan appeared in the popular teen drama Riverdale, he was no longer the young boy from commercials, but a young man carving out a serious career. His role as Jeffrey Augustine, though small, carried significant weight within the storyline. Ironically, the character was written as the one who caused the sudden death of Fred Andrews, the beloved character played by Luke Perry. For fans of the show, it was just another shocking plot twist. For Ryan, it was an achievement that placed him within one of television's most widely watched series. To the outside world, he seemed to be on an upward path, the kind of trajectory young actors dream about. But behind the performances, the cameras, and the bright lights, another story was unfolding, one far darker and less visible. Ryan struggled internally with feelings of inadequacy, anxiety, and depression. These shadows lingered quietly, tucked behind the mask of a young man who appeared to be achieving success. Like many actors, he faced the pressure of auditions that didn't always go his way, roles that fell through, and the constant scrutiny of an industry that often values appearance over authenticity. For Ryan, these disappointments struck deeper than for most. Each setback reinforced a growing sense of hopelessness. At home, Barbara noticed her son's struggles. She remained his confidant, encouraging him through his battles with self-doubt and mental health. Friends later described her as a mother who never gave up on Ryan, a woman who would listen when he spoke of his worries and tried to comfort him when he withdrew. She was gentle, compassionate, and steady, the type of parent who believed that with love and patience, her son could find his way. But the demons Ryan wrestled with were not easily quieted. Depression, when left untreated, can transform from an internal battle into a dangerous storm. In Ryan's case, those storms grew louder as he entered his early 20s. By 2019 and early 2020, Ryan's inner turmoil had intensified. He began keeping journals where he confessed feelings of despair and even violent ideation. He was losing his grip on the line between thought and action, documenting impulses that hinted at the tragedies to come. His acting career, once a source of pride, felt increasingly distant. Depression left him with little energy to push forward, and self-doubt convinced him he was wasting his potential. To those outside his home, he was just another young actor navigating the uncertainties of the industry. To Barbara, he was her son in crisis, a young man she loved deeply but could not completely reach. The setting of their lives in Squamish reflected the quiet beauty of British Columbia. Nestled between mountains and sea, the community offered a peaceful backdrop that seemed far removed from Hollywood pressures. In the family home, Barbara and Ryan lived a life marked by routine and simplicity. She filled the space with music, often playing piano in the evenings, a source of comfort and calm. Ryan, meanwhile, spent much of his time alone, consumed by thoughts he rarely shared in full. Their relationship remained close, but beneath the surface was the widening gulf created by Ryan's deteriorating mental state. The global context of early 2020 added to the weight pressing down on Ryan. The COVID-19 pandemic had begun to change the world, shutting down film productions and isolating communities. For a young actor already questioning his future, the uncertainty of the industry during the pandemic added another layer of despair. His depression deepened. Isolated at home, with fewer distractions and fewer external anchors, Ryan found himself in a dangerous spiral. It was in this period that his violent fantasies grew stronger, fueled by hopelessness and untreated illness. Barbara remained unaware of just how dark his thoughts had become. To her, Ryan was struggling, yes, but still the son she knew, the boy she had raised, the young man she believed could overcome his troubles. She did not see him as a threat. She could not imagine that the person she loved most in the world was capable of harming her. That tragic blind spot, born of maternal trust and love, would soon lead to a night that changed everything. The contrast between Ryan's external life and his internal turmoil is what makes his story so haunting. On paper, he was a success. A working actor with credits many would envy, a supportive mother, and a safe home in a beautiful part of Canada. But beneath that, there was a young man unraveling, losing himself to depression and violent ideation, trapped in a mind that offered no relief. As March 2020 approached, the line between his private thoughts and his public actions grew thinner. The storm that had been brewing quietly within him was about to break, setting in motion events that would devastate not just his family, but shock an entire nation. It was within the quiet of that home in Squamish, with the mountains standing tall around them, that Ryan's story took its tragic turn. The first part of his life, the childhood filled with opportunity, the early successes on screen, and the unwavering support of a loving mother, was about to collapse under the weight of his inner demons. What began as a promising journey into the entertainment industry was leading toward a night of irreversible violence. A night when the piano music in their home would be silenced forever. On the final evening of March 2020, the quiet town of Squamish carried its usual stillness, but inside the Grantham home, the silence concealed a storm ready to break. Barbara Waite had no reason to believe that her night would end any differently from countless others. She spent her time the way she often did, at the piano, letting the notes fill the home with calm. For her, music was a form of meditation, a language of peace. For Ryan, who sat in the same house, it became the background to a decision he had been circling in his mind for weeks. The rifle was already in his possession, a .22 caliber weapon he had handled before, but now it represented something darker, an outlet for the violent ideation that had consumed him. Ryan had been slipping deeper into his mental crisis, trapped in an echo chamber of hopelessness. In his journals and thoughts, he wrestled with grand fantasies of violence, ranging from self-destruction to the idea of mass murder. At one point, he considered driving east all the way to Ottawa, with the intent of assassinating the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau. The thought carried with it an almost cinematic quality, a delusion that reflected how far his mind had drifted from reality. But deep down, Ryan lacked the resolve or the means to execute such an act. Instead, his violence would take a form far more intimate and irreversible, against the one person who had stood by him through every stage of his young life. The decision to target Barbara was not sudden. It emerged from the depths of his depression. Ryan later told investigators that he wanted to spare his mother from witnessing the despair and destruction he felt he was destined to bring upon himself. He imagined his suicide would devastate her, and in a twisted logic, convinced himself that killing her was an act of mercy. Yet, in reality, it was the manifestation of a violent compulsion, the collapse of reason under the weight of untreated illness. As she played the piano that night, unaware, Ryan raised the rifle. A single shot to the back of her head ended her life instantly. The moment after the gun fired, the house transformed into a space of unnatural silence. The music stopped, replaced with the ringing echo of finality. Barbara lay slumped over, her last moments stolen by the son she trusted most. Ryan stood in the aftermath, both horrified and eerily calm. He retrieved a camera and began recording. The video he filmed in the immediate aftermath was chilling, not only for its content but for the detached way he confessed to the act. The footage captured his mother's lifeless body and his explanation, as though documenting the crime would give it context or meaning. That night, he remained in the house with Barbara's body. Hours passed as he wrestled with what to do next. His mind, still turbulent, considered grandiose ideas, continuing on to kill others, creating a spectacle, leaving a mark on the world through violence. But the reality of what he had done already weighed heavily on him. The fantasies of mass violence faded under the crushing truth of his mother's death. For Barbara's family and friends, who would later learn of her final moments, the tragedy was doubled. Not only was she killed, but she died at the hands of the very person she had loved most unconditionally. In the days immediately following, Ryan's actions reflected a man unraveling. He filled his car with weapons, ammunition, and camping supplies, still entertaining the idea of heading east. Maps and plans suggested he was clinging to a dangerous fantasy. Yet as he drove through British Columbia, reality caught up to him. The weight of the crime bore down with every mile. His thoughts of assassinations and attacks dissolved into a fog of despair. Eventually, his path turned away from violence and toward surrender. He drove to a Vancouver police station, approached the front desk, and confessed plainly. He had killed his mother. Officers later testified that his demeanor was subdued, almost resigned, as if the act of turning himself in was the only choice left to him. The confession was shocking in its clarity, the type of admission few officers ever encounter. When investigators arrived at the family home in Squamish, they found Barbara exactly as Ryan had left her, the scene preserved with the quiet devastation of domestic homicide. As the investigation began, details emerged that painted a fuller picture of Ryan's state of mind leading up to the killing. His journals revealed months of escalating despair. His violent ideation had not been fleeting thoughts but recurring obsessions, carefully documented and spiraling in intensity. His video confession added to the evidence, showing not only what he had done but the mindset with which he framed it. To the outside world, these recordings were chilling artifacts. To the court, they became crucial in understanding the balance between intent and mental illness. The impact on Barbara's family was immediate and profound. To lose her was already devastating, but to lose her to Ryan created a wound beyond words. In interviews and courtroom statements, family members described the impossible grief of mourning both the victim and the perpetrator. Barbara's relatives recalled her kindness, her unwavering love, and the life of a woman who had given so much. They remembered holidays, laughter, and her devotion to Ryan. That devotion, tragically, was met with betrayal in the most final form. In the media, the case captured international attention. Headlines emphasized Ryan's acting credits, especially his role in Riverdale. For audiences who had watched him on screen, the real-life parallels were unsettling. In the show, his character had caused the death of another. In life, Ryan had crossed the line from acting out violence to committing it. News outlets carried images of him in court, once a familiar face from television now redefined as a defendant in a murder trial. As the case moved forward, the narrative took on multiple layers. Was Ryan a cold-blooded killer, or a deeply ill young man whose mental health had spiraled unchecked until tragedy struck? The answer would not be simple. Prosecutors pointed to his planning, his confession, and the cold execution of the act as proof of premeditation. The defense argued that his state of mind was fractured, dominated by depression and self-destructive ideation that clouded his ability to make rational choices. Both sides agreed on one thing: Barbara Waite had been a devoted mother who deserved none of what had happened. In the months after his arrest, Ryan remained in custody, undergoing psychiatric evaluations. His life as an actor was over. His name, once associated with youthful promise, now sat alongside the headlines of infamy. For the public, his story became part cautionary tale, part tragedy, and part indictment of how mental health struggles are often left to fester until they erupt. For those closest to Barbara, it remained something far simpler and more painful: the loss of a beloved woman, taken from them without warning, by the son she had loved unconditionally. The night of March 31st had closed one chapter of Ryan Grantham's life and opened another that would unfold in the stark confines of the courtroom. Ahead lay questions of justice, responsibility, and punishment, questions that would force the court to navigate the delicate line between mental illness and accountability. The boy who had once stood before cameras as a rising actor now faced the most unforgiving audience of all: the law. When Ryan Grantham walked into the British Columbia Supreme Court, the image of the boy actor from screens was gone. In his place stood a thin young man in a prison uniform, his face marked by exhaustion and shame. The trial would not be about denying the crime. Ryan had confessed both in writing and on video, but about understanding why it had happened and what justice should look like. Every detail of that night, every word from his journals, and every frame of his recording became part of the evidence. A window into a mind where fantasy and despair had collided with fatal consequences. The prosecution began by presenting the facts with precision. Ryan had retrieved the rifle, approached his mother from behind, and fired while she was playing piano. He had recorded himself, spoken clearly of what he had done, and then set out with plans to commit further acts of violence before surrendering. To the Crown, this was not a sudden snap of madness but a deliberate, premeditated act. They emphasized his planning, the fact that he had loaded his car with weapons and ammunition, and his contemplation of killing the Prime Minister. It was evidence, they argued, of someone fully aware of his actions and intent. They asked the court to see him not only as a son who killed his mother but as an individual who posed a potential danger to society. The defense countered with a portrait of a young man undone by mental illness. They acknowledged the crime in full, offering no attempt to erase responsibility, but they asked the court to consider Ryan's state of mind. Experts testified to his long history of depression, suicidal tendencies, and fantasies of self-destruction. His obsession with violent ideation, they argued, was not driven by malice but by despair. They described his actions as those of someone who had lost touch with the rational balance of thought, someone who believed, however twisted, that killing his mother might spare her from the suffering of seeing him destroy himself. His lawyers urged the judge to weigh his illness as a mitigating factor. In the courtroom, the weight of grief was palpable. Members of Barbara Waite's family sat through the proceedings, listening as the life of a woman they adored was dissected through evidence and legal argument. For them, Barbara was not just a victim in a case file but a vibrant person with a gentle spirit, a woman who loved music, nature, and above all, her son. They had lost her in the most unimaginable way, and yet they were also forced to watch Ryan, Barbara's child, their relative, stand as the perpetrator. Testimony from the family spoke of devastation compounded by contradiction, mourning the woman who was gone while also mourning the boy who had taken her from them. When it came time for Ryan to address the court, his voice was subdued, carrying the heavy burden of remorse. He spoke of his mother's kindness and the debt he could never repay. He admitted to the selfishness of his act, acknowledging that no explanation could justify the pain he had caused. His words were not those of denial but of a young man confronting the enormity of what he had done. Observers noted that his apology seemed genuine, but apologies could not restore what was lost. Justice Kathleen Kerr listened carefully to both sides. Her role was not only to weigh punishment but to interpret how the law should respond to such a layered tragedy. In her ruling, she spoke of the deliberate nature of the crime, acknowledging that Ryan had made choices leading up to the killing that revealed intent. At the same time, she recognized the profound influence of his mental health struggles. The sentence she handed down reflected that balance. Life imprisonment with parole ineligibility for 14 years. It was a punishment that ensured accountability while acknowledging the mitigating factor of his illness. For Ryan, it meant the possibility of eventual freedom, but only after a long period of incarceration. The verdict brought a measure of closure but not relief. For Barbara's family, the sentence could not replace her, nor could it erase the way she died. They described the ruling as just, but justice in this case was bittersweet. They left the courtroom carrying the same grief they had carried since the night of March 31st, grief that would not dissipate with time. The tragedy had left them with scars that no judgment could heal. The media coverage of the trial spread widely, reaching audiences in Canada and abroad. Headlines focused on the fall of a young actor who had once walked the red carpets of film festivals and appeared on popular television shows. The irony of his Riverdale role, a character responsible for another's death, was not lost on the public. Yet beyond the sensational headlines, the story resonated for deeper reasons. It forced conversations about mental health, the pressures of young actors in the entertainment industry, and the dangerous consequences when depression festers without treatment. In prison, Ryan's life shifted to the stark routines of incarceration. Stripped of acting, stripped of freedom, he was left with time to reflect. Reports from psychiatric assessments noted his remorse and his willingness to seek therapy, though progress remained slow. He was a young man whose entire future had been rewritten by one night of violence. For him, each day in prison was a reminder of the life he had taken and the life he had thrown away. His name, once linked to promise, would forever be tied to infamy. The broader cultural impact of the case lingered long after sentencing. Advocates pointed to it as an example of why mental health support must be prioritized, especially for young adults struggling with depression. Others reflected on the vulnerability of family relationships, the way love can sometimes blind those closest to someone in crisis. Barbara Waite, remembered by her friends as gentle and selfless, had become a symbol of tragic loss, a reminder of how violence can intrude even into the most loving of homes. For audiences who once knew Ryan only as a character on screen, the story offered a chilling lesson in the difference between fiction and reality. On television, violence can be rewound, characters can be resurrected, and stories can move on. In real life, the bullet fired in a quiet Squamish home ended a life forever, silenced a piano that once filled the air with music, and left a family in ruins. The final chapter of the case is not written in court documents but in memory. For Barbara Waite's family, every holiday, every gathering, is marked by her absence. For Ryan, every day is a reckoning with the irreversible choice he made. And for the public, the case remains a haunting example of how quickly a promising future can collapse when inner battles go unresolved. The story of Ryan Grantham is one of tragedy on every side. A mother who gave everything, a son consumed by despair, and a crime that destroyed 2 lives in one single act. In the end, what remains is a silence where once there was music, a family left to carry grief, and a cautionary tale echoing far beyond the walls of a courtroom. The boy who once brought characters to life on screen became the architect of a real-life tragedy, a reminder that behind the lights and credits are human beings whose struggles, if left unseen, can end in devastation.